He lost his rifle on the ice, and with it, his only shortcut through winter. 120 frozen miles now stood between him and survival. No rescue, no second tools, no room for error. In this country, distance is not measured in miles, it's measured in calories, decisions, and time. And winter was already closing the gap. Caleb Rourke had left the timbered river valley before dawn, when the stars still held their sharpness and every breath glittered. January in the upper country meant daylight arrived thin and departed early, and he measured it by the feel in his fingers. His mittens were stiff with old sweat dried into salt, a warning he took seriously. He carried a small pack, a bedroll lashed tight, and a long rifle balanced across his forearm, the familiar weight that steadied his thinking. A week's hunt had gone quiet, but he expected to make the trading post by tomorrow's sunset, alone. Across the lake, wind scoured the surface into ripples of hard snow, and the old ice sang in low, patient cracks. He knew the sounds. They were not panic, they were pressure, the whole sheet settling. Still, he walked as if he owed the lake respect, placing each step where drift had packed. The spruce shore had vanished into a gray band, and behind him his own tracks filled slowly, erased by powder. Isolation was not a mood here. It was a condition that could turn minor trouble into a sentence. He kept his rifle away from slip and ice. Midway across, he stopped to listen, not because he feared the ice, but because he trusted it enough to hear it. A faint rasp came from his shoulder strap, leather stiffened by cold. He flexed, meaning to settle the sling, and the buckle pinched, then released with a tiny snap that sounded absurdly small. The rifle slid, slow at first, then faster as gravity found its angle. Caleb's gloved hand closed on air. Wood and iron struck the ice once, skittered, and found a seam where the lake had breathed open. For a heartbeat it balanced, then tilted into darkness. He dropped to a knee, eyes fixed on the black slit no wider than his thumb. The ice around it was laced with white stress lines, delicate as spiderwebs. He did not slam the butt with his fist or hack at it. That was how a man turned a crack into a hole big enough to swallow him. He laid his ear near the surface and heard water moving under, a slow undercurrent that would carry the rifle away if it had not already sunk. He had a cord in his pocket, but no hook, no light, not even hope. The loss landed in his stomach heavier than the rifle had ever been. Without it, he could not take a deer cleanly, could not reach across a frozen meadow for a ptarmigan, could not fire a warning shot if wolves shadowed his trail. More than meat, the rifle was time. It let a man trade minutes for food. He looked at the sky, gauging the sun's weak climb, and did the arithmetic he hated. 120 miles to the post, maybe 6 days on foot in this snow, and temperatures that could dive to 40 below at night. Caleb forced himself into routine, because routine kept panic from steering. First, he checked his hands for wet, rubbing snow across the leather to dry it before it froze solid. Second, he counted what remained: knife, steel striker, a twist of tinder in a tin, 1 plug of bacon fat, and 2 matches wrapped in waxed paper. Third, he marked the location by lining the crack with a distant dead pine, the only landmark on a lake that offered none. Safety mattered now. 1 fall, 1 soaked boot, and the walk would end early. He stood, letting the wind decide. Back at the last settlement, a storekeeper had laughed at the way Caleb treated his rifle like a partner, wiping it, warming the lock under his coat, sleeping with it within reach. The man had said steel was steel, and a modern hunter could always buy another. Caleb remembered that easy confidence and felt it dissolve in the air like breath. Out here, replacement was not a transaction. It was a journey, a gamble, and a page torn away. The lake offered no apology, only space, and the wind that kept pushing snow into his tracks as if erasing witnesses. He walked to the lake's far edge, where cattails poked through drifts and alder thickets promised fuel.
Turning back would mean crossing the same ice again, then doubling his distance with less daylight and weaker legs. Going forward meant committing to a route he had only traveled once, following a chain of creek bottoms toward the trading post, hoping the ice stayed thick and the storms stayed north. He imagined the rifle lying under the lake, beyond reach, and felt calm settle over him. Loss was done. Planning remained. He tightened his belt to hush hunger and started counting steps. At the first line of trees, he built a small fire, not for comfort, but to reset his world. Pencil-thin twigs caught fast, and he warmed his fingers without sweating them. The smoke rose straight, a rare mercy, and he watched it like an oath that he could still choose well. Behind him, the lake lay blank and indifferent, hiding his rifle and the confidence that came with it. Ahead, the creek corridor tightened into shadowed timber, and the day was shortening. Caleb stepped into the trees and did not look back. Turning back was no longer possible from here. On the frontier, a rifle was never just a weapon. It was a system carried on the shoulder. It turned wilderness into a place where time could be negotiated, and mistakes could sometimes be paid for in meat instead of blood. Lose it, and the land did not become hostile all at once. It simply stopped cooperating. What remained was distance, cold, and the quiet math of hunger. Caleb Rourke understood this long before the lake took his rifle. He had grown up where winter decided the calendar, and men learned early which tools mattered and why. His father had taught him that strength was unreliable and courage was noisy, but systems were patient. The rifle fit into that thinking as cleanly as a peg into a hole. It reached farther than a thrown stone, struck cleaner than a snare, and saved hours of wandering when calories were already bleeding away. On a good day, it meant one shot, one animal, and a full belly that carried a man through the night. Calories were the first gift a rifle offered, and the most misunderstood by people who had never walked hungry. In deep winter, a man burned thousands of calories just to stay warm, more to move, and even more to think clearly. A rifle compressed that cost. It allowed Caleb to trade a single careful approach for days of stored energy in the form of fat and meat. Without it, every calorie would have to be earned slowly, with traps that took time to set and luck to fill, or by foraging what little winter allowed. Hunger did not roar at first. It whispered, and that whisper stole judgment. Protection came next, though not in the way stories liked to tell it. Wolves and bears were part of the country, but fear of them was often exaggerated by people who needed a villain. The rifle's real protection lay in its authority. The sound of it carried far, announcing a human presence that most animals avoided. It also protected against smaller dangers, a wounded moose thrashing near camp, a desperate dog gone feral ere an abandoned cabin, even the simple confidence to move through open ground without hesitation. Without a rifle, every encounter took longer, and time in winter was the one resource that never renewed. Then there was the protection no one talked about, the one Caleb felt most sharply now that it was gone. The rifle stabilized the mind. Its weight on the arm was a reminder that problems had solutions and that effort could still bend outcomes. Men on the frontier did not romanticize tools, but they respected what those tools did to the thinking of the person who carried them. A rifle quieted the small panic that crept in when days shortened and storms rolled through unannounced. It was not bravado, it was structure. Take that away, and a man had to build calm from experience alone. Modern assumptions would have dismissed this loss as inconvenience. Someone raised with roads, radios, and stocked shelves believed redundancy came from abundance. If one tool failed, another waited close by. On the frontier, redundancy was different. It was layered, intentional, and often invisible. Caleb had not carried a rifle because he loved it. He carried it because it backed up everything else. Fire without food bought hours, not days. Shelter without calories became a coffin once the body began to cannibalize itself. The rifle stitched these systems together, making each one more forgiving. Caleb's competence came from knowing these limits. He had trapped in lean winters, reading sign under snow and setting deadfalls that worked even when fingers numbed. He had traveled long distances on little, pacing himself so sweat never soaked his layers and stopping before exhaustion turned into stupidity. He knew how to melt snow efficiently, how to bank coals so a fire survived the night, and how to choose campsites that blocked wind rather than inviting it. None of this vanished with the rifle. What vanished was margin. That margin mattered more than courage. Without it, decisions narrowed fast. Should he push farther today to reach timber, burning energy he could not replace, or stop early and risk a longer journey overall? Should he detour toward a frozen creek where traps might work, or follow the straight line that promised progress but no food? These were not emotional questions. They were calculations that had to be made with a body that was already spending more than it earned. Exposure killed loudly, but starvation set the trap quietly and waited. Caleb felt the first signs of that trap as the day wore on. Not pain, not weakness, but a subtle impatience, a desire to hurry that had no logic behind it. He recognized it for what it was. Hunger did not make men weak first, it made them careless. It shortened planning horizons and tempted risk, whispering that speed could replace preparation. The frontier was full of graves where that lie had been believed. He slowed his pace deliberately, letting the urge pass like a gust of wind through bare branches. As dusk approached, he thought again of the rifle resting somewhere beneath the ice, unreachable, and stripped the image of its emotion. Sentiment wasted energy. What mattered was adapting the system. He would have to think like men had before firearms made winter travel tolerable. That meant traps instead of shots, patience instead of pursuit, and an acceptance that some days would end with nothing gained but distance lost. It meant treating fat like gold and movement like debt. The country had not changed, only his relationship to it had. Night settled in with the cold clarity of a rule enforced. Stars sharpened overhead, and the temperature slid lower, pressing against his layers. Caleb banked his fire carefully and lay still, listening to the forest tick and creak. He knew exposure would not take him tonight. His shelter and discipline were enough for that. What waited ahead was subtler and more dangerous. Each mile without calories would cost more than the last, and the distance to safety did not care about effort. Somewhere between hunger and cold, the frontier decided outcomes. Without calories, distance became lethal. Survival does not begin with courage, it begins with inventory. In winter country, a man lives or dies by what remains after loss strips everything down to essentials. Each object must justify its weight, its purpose, and its cost in energy. Tonight, Caleb Rourke measured his chances not by hope, but by what his hands could still reach. He unpacked slowly, the way experience demanded, laying each item where firelight could reach it without inviting sparks. The knife came first, a plain carbon steel blade worn thin from years of sharpening. It was not large, but it held an edge and felt balanced, which mattered more than size. With it, he could cut saplings, shape trap triggers, split kindling, and dress whatever luck or patience delivered. Without it, the rest of the kit lost half its value. Tools were not independent out here. They were connected. Next came the fire kit, a striker wrapped in leather, a small tin with charred cloth and resin scrapings, and the 2 waxed matches he had already counted twice. Fire was not comfort, it was control. It dried clothing, hardened snow into water, reset numb fingers, and gave the night a boundary. But fire also demanded discipline. Every flame required fuel gathered with effort, and every effort spent calories he could not replace easily. Fire would be used with intention, not habit. His clothing followed, and he inspected it with the same seriousness. Wool layers, patched but intact, an outer coat stiff with frost, and boots whose soles had been resoled once already. Clothing in winter travel was not about warmth alone. It was about managing moisture. Sweat killed faster than cold, and moving too hard would soak layers that could not be dried without fire and time. He flexed his feet, testing circulation, and loosened the laces slightly to keep blood moving overnight. Small adjustments now prevented big consequences later. Cordage was last, coiled neatly. It was not much, but enough to matter. With it he could set snares, lash shelter poles, repair bindings, and improvise tools that replaced what he had lost. Cordage was potential made portable. Without it, ingenuity stalled. He ran it through his fingers, checking for frays, and tucked it away carefully. Waste was a luxury he no longer had. Once the inventory was complete, Caleb packed everything back with deliberation, feeling the weight settle against his shoulders. The pack was lighter than it had been with the rifle, but that did not mean it was easier to carry. Every pound still demanded energy, and energy was now his most limited resource. He had learned long ago that the body paid interest on every careless movement. Lift too much, walk too fast, or stumble once, and the debt came due at night, when shivering burned calories he could not spare. Carry limits were not fixed numbers. They shifted with terrain, temperature, and health. In deep cold, even standing still cost fuel. Walking through powder doubled it. Breaking trail through drifts could triple it. Caleb adjusted his expectations accordingly. He would move when the ground allowed, rest before fatigue forced him to, and stop early enough to build shelter without rushing. Rushing was how men sweated, and sweat was how winter collected payment. This was where system thinking took over, the discipline that separated survival from improvisation. Heat came first, because without it, nothing else functioned. Shelter and fire worked together to trap warmth and reduce loss. Water followed, because dehydration mimicked exhaustion and clouded judgment. Snow would be melted carefully, never eaten raw, and only in quantities that justified the fuel spent. Calories came next, the most fragile system of all. Every decision would be measured against how much energy it cost versus how much it returned. Movement was last because movement connected everything, but also consumed everything. These systems did not operate in isolation. A poor shelter meant more firewood burned. More firewood meant more movement. More movement meant more calories spent. Miss one link and the whole chain failed quietly. Caleb had seen strong men break this way. Not from a single mistake, but from a series of small, reasonable choices that added up to collapse. He refused to let impatience write his plan. The first hard rule formed clearly in his mind, the way rules did when they were earned rather than taught. Slow was safer than fast. Not always, and not everywhere, but here and now it was law. Speed promised distance, but distance without fuel was an illusion. Better to cover fewer miles well than more miles poorly. Better to arrive late with strength than early with nothing left. Winter punished haste because haste multiplied errors. He tested this rule against temptation. The trail ahead followed a frozen creek that might allow faster travel, but it also offered fewer windbreaks. Cutting cross-country through timber would be slower, but it provided shelter and fuel. The faster option called to him with the promise of progress. The slower one answered with the promise of survival. He chose the trees, feeling the decision settle like a weight lifted rather than added. As the night deepened, he adjusted his plan again, breaking the journey into segments his body could afford. No more chasing daylight until collapse. No more gambling on finding shelter at the last moment. Each day would end with enough light to work, enough strength to think, and enough discipline to stop when stopping felt wrong. This was not retreat, it was strategy. Caleb lay back, eyes on the stars framed by black branches, and let the forest soundless around him. Inventory was finished, but its meaning was still unfolding. What he carried was enough to live if used correctly, and enough to die if used carelessly. The distance ahead had not changed, but the rules had. Tomorrow, every choice would echo. Every mile saved today might cost a life tomorrow. Winter country does not resist a man. It waits for him to misread it. The land offers surfaces that look solid, paths that appear inviting, and shortcuts that promise speed. In truth, every feature carries a cost that must be paid in heat, time, or flesh. Caleb Rourke moved forward, knowing the ground itself would now be his most constant adversary. The terrain unfolded in layers rather than lines. Frozen lakes opened like pale clearings between darker bands of timber, their surfaces scoured smooth by wind that never rested. Creek bottoms twisted through spruce and alder, offering shelter but demanding careful footing over drifts that hid water and air pockets beneath. Ridges rose low and rounded, their tops stripped bare by gusts that cut through clothing and stole warmth faster than fire could replace it. Between these features lay wind corridors, invisible channels where cold air accelerated, turning mild exposure into danger without warning.
Caleb chose his route with restraint. Lakes offered speed, but speed came with exposure. Timber offered fuel and cover, but every step through it cost effort. He favored edges, skirting frozen water where trees still broke the wind, using their shadows to rest his eyes and their trunks to anchor his sense of direction. He read the snow constantly. Hard-packed surfaces meant yesterday's wind and easier travel. Soft drifts meant exhaustion. Crusted layers that held for one step and collapsed on the next were the worst of all, because they punished rhythm and stole balance. Foot travel in deep cold was a discipline of small movements. He placed his feet flat to spread weight, avoiding the heel strikes that cracked crust and wrenched ankles. He shortened his stride, conserving energy and reducing sweat. When the ground rose, he angled across rather than straight up, letting gravity work gradually instead of all at once. When it fell away, he descended carefully, knowing that a fall here was not a bruise, but a potential ending. Getting wet, even briefly, turned survival into a race he could not win. Cold altered mechanics further. Muscles stiffened and demanded longer warm-up, but warming too much created moisture that froze as soon as movement slowed. Caleb paused often, not to rest fully, but to regulate heat. He opened his coat for a minute, venting warmth before sweat formed, then closed it again before chill took hold. His breath frosted the scarf at his mouth, and he knocked the ice away regularly to keep airflow clear. These small rituals looked like fussiness to outsiders, but they were how experienced travelers stayed alive. The light itself became a hazard. Sun on snow reflected upward, flattening the world into glare that erased depth and distance. Snow blindness did not arrive dramatically. It crept in as headache, then pain, then an inability to see detail at all. Caleb narrowed his vision with a strip of cloth tied low, letting only a thin band of light reach his eyes. He rested them whenever he could, looking into the darker green of spruce rather than the white spread of open ground. Sight was navigation, and navigation was survival. Frostbite worked the same way, quietly and without drama. Fingers lost feeling first, then toes, then ears and nose. Pain came later, often too late to matter. Caleb checked himself constantly, pressing skin, flexing joints, and watching for the dull, waxy look that signaled trouble. When he stopped, he did not sit directly on snow, but built a small platform of boughs to block the cold from climbing into him. He kept moving just enough to maintain circulation, never enough to sweat. Impatience was the real killer, the force that turned manageable risk into catastrophe. Winter travel punished those who tried to outpace the land. A man who hurried took straighter lines across exposed ice, ignored the first sting of numbness, and pushed until fatigue dulled judgment. Caleb had seen the results years before, a frozen pack abandoned beside a lake, tracks wandering in widening circles before disappearing altogether. The land had not chased that man, it had simply waited. Each decision Caleb made carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Cutting across a lake saved hours, but burned warmth.
Detouring through timber preserved heat but stole daylight. Stopping early protected energy but extended the journey. There were no perfect choices, only better ones made consistently. He reminded himself that progress was not measured in miles alone, but in condition. Arriving with strength mattered more than arriving sooner. As afternoon faded, the forest thinned and the ground leveled. Ahead, the trees opened onto another lake, wider than the last, its surface polished by wind into a pale, endless plain. From the shore, it looked easy, even welcoming, a straight shot that could swallow miles in a single push. The air above it shimmered with cold, and there was nowhere to hide once committed. Caleb stopped at the edge, studying the ice, feeling the wind probe for weakness in his clothing. He knew the lake would test everything he had learned so far. Speed beckoned, but exposure waited. Shelter vanished after the first step, and retreat would grow harder with every yard crossed. He adjusted his pack straps, tightened his hood, and scanned the far shore, estimating distance and time. The forest behind him stood dark and patient, offering safety at the cost of delay. The open ice ahead promised progress, fast, exposed, unforgiving. When the rifle vanished beneath the ice, fire inherited its responsibilities. It could not hunt, but it could preserve what hunting once guaranteed. Fire created warmth, marked presence, and steadied the mind when isolation pressed hardest. In winter country, a flame was not comfort, it was continuity. Caleb learned quickly that fire now sat at the center of every decision. Without a rifle, he could no longer shorten days with a single shot or bank calories for tomorrow. What he could do was protect the energy he still had. Fire warmed his core so fewer calories burned fighting the cold. It dried the edges of damp clothing before ice claimed them. It pushed back the darkness just enough to let planning continue. Even the knowledge that he could make it again tomorrow steadied his thinking, a psychological anchor heavier than any weapon. He treated fire as a system, not an event. The first step was location, chosen before hands numbed and daylight failed. He looked for ground shielded from wind, close to timber but far enough from deadfall to avoid sparks climbing upward. Snow was scraped down to earth or packed hard, creating a base that would not melt into slush and steal heat. This decision alone saved fuel because a well-placed fire worked harder with less wood. The second step was fuel selection, the part that separated success from frustration. Under snow, not all wood was equal. Caleb searched for standing dead branches still attached to trunks, protected by moisture, by bark and height. He snapped small twigs first, listening for the clean crack that meant dryness. Larger pieces came later, split to expose pale, dry centers. He avoided logs buried deep, knowing the effort to free and dry them cost more energy than they returned. Fuel gathered before lighting was fuel saved later, when darkness narrowed options. The third step was ignition, done deliberately, without waste. He used the striker and char cloth first, preserving matches as insurance rather than convenience. Sparks caught in the tin, transferred to fine shavings shaved patiently with the knife's spine. He fed the flame gradually, letting heat build instead of smothering it with ambition. Fire liked patience. Rushing it only exhausted tinder and nerves. The fourth step was management. Once burning, the fire was shaped to purpose. He built it long and narrow when cooking or melting snow, maximizing service heat. At night, he banked coals against thicker pieces that would last, not flare. Flames were kept modest, enough to warm hands and thoughts, not enough to invite accidents or demand constant feeding. Fire that required babysitting stole rest, and rest was as precious as warmth. As the days shortened, Caleb learned to read his fire the way he once read rifle sights. The color of flame told him about wood quality. The sound of popping warned of trapped moisture that could send sparks into dry cloth. Smoke direction revealed shifts in wind that might demand shelter adjustment. Fire was information as much as heat, and ignoring its signals was a mistake the cold punished quickly. Fuel under snow demanded foresight. He gathered more than he needed while light remained, stacking it within reach so night movements stayed minimal. He learned which trees offered resin-rich kindling even in deep winter, and which branches snapped clean despite weeks of cold. This knowledge replaced the rifle's certainty with skill earned slowly, and it rewarded attention rather than strength. There were risks, and Caleb treated them seriously. Hypothermia did not announce itself dramatically. It crept in as clumsiness and poor decisions. Fire helped, but only if used correctly. He warmed gradually, never thrusting numb hands directly into flame, knowing sudden heat could damage tissue without pain. Burns were another quiet danger. Clothing caught fire easily when dry, and panic turned small flames into disasters. He kept water and snow close, clearing the area around the fire so there was room to react rather than flail. He slept with the fire's glow at his back, not in front of his face, using reflected heat from a low wall of snow or logs. This trapped warmth without drying his breath into ice that could freeze eyelashes shut. When he woke, he fed the coals carefully, coaxing them back rather than starting anew. Each preserved ember was time saved, energy conserved, and confidence restored. Fire also served as signal, though Caleb did not expect rescue. A column of smoke by day or a steady glow by night marked human intent in a land that erased traces quickly. It reminded him that he was not merely passing through, but asserting presence. That mattered more than he had once admitted. Loneliness did not break men here. Uncertainty did. Fire reduced uncertainty to manageable scale. As evening settled again, the temperature dropped sharply, compressing the window for mistakes. Shadows lengthened, and the forest's sounds thinned until even his own movements felt loud. Caleb finished his preparations before darkness fully claimed the ground, knowing that fire built in haste invited error. He struck the flame, watched it take, and felt the familiar easing in his chest. Tomorrow would demand movement, decisions, and restraint. Tonight demanded care. The flame flickered steadily, but the margin around it shrank with every passing minute. In winter, nightfall did not merely end the day, it compressed the margin to minutes. Winter does not kill by cold alone. It kills by arithmetic. Every breath, every step, every shiver draws from a ledger that must be balanced. On the frontier, men learned that hunger arrived long before collapse, changing how the world was judged and how risks were chosen. Caleb Rourke felt that accounting begin the moment his rifle disappeared. In sub-zero travel, the body became a furnace that demanded constant feeding. Even at rest, it burned calories simply to keep blood warm and organs functioning. Movement multiplied that cost. Breaking trail through snow, hauling a pack, and fighting wind could drain thousands of calories in a single day. The colder it grew, the more expensive stillness became, because shivering was work disguised as rest. Caleb knew this not as theory, but as memory, from winters when meals were thin and mornings felt heavier than nights. Without a gun, food gathering slowed to the pace of patience. Traps replaced pursuit, and patience replaced certainty. He looked for sign where animals conserved energy just as he did, along creek edges, beneath spruce boughs, and near tangles that offered protection from wind. Small game traveled predictable routes, saving calories the same way he now did. Caleb set simple snares with care, using cordits sparingly, anchoring them to stakes that would not snap in the cold. Each trap was a question posed to the forest, and the answer might take days. Scavenging demanded a different discipline. Winter stripped the land, but it also preserved what had fallen. Caleb watched for ravens and fox tracks, signs that something larger had died or that scraps remained. He understood the risk of investing energy in uncertain reward. Walking miles to inspect a carcass that held nothing usable could cost more than it returned. He learned to read from a distance, letting tracks and birds decide whether closer inspection was worth the effort. Hunger punished optimism first. Fat conservation mattered as much as acquisition. Without steady intake, the body turned inward, burning reserves that could not be replaced easily. Caleb adjusted his movement to protect what he had. He avoided sweating, which forced the body to spend calories reheating. He rested before exhaustion demanded it, knowing recovery cost more than prevention. When he did eat, even small amounts, he ate deliberately, letting the body absorb and settle rather than rushing back into motion. Meals were no longer about satisfaction, they were about efficiency. Historically, this was the reality hunters knew well, though it rarely survived in stories. Many winters passed with men eating little more than melted snow and a handful of scraps, waiting for traps to pay off or weather to shift. Diaries from the period spoke plainly of hunger, not as heroism, but as routine. It was common to lose weight steadily through the cold months, strength tapering until spring returned or luck intervened. The rifle had changed this pattern, but it had never erased it completely. Caleb carried that history with him as caution rather than comfort. He refused to chase large game he could not secure without a firearm. Wounding an animal without killing it cleanly wasted energy and invited loss. Instead, he focused on what winter still allowed, the occasional hare, birds caught on the ground at night, and whatever fat he could scavenge from old kills. Success came slowly, often in pieces so small they would have disappointed a less disciplined man. Here, disappointment was irrelevant. Survival measured gains differently. The hardest part was managing the mind. Hunger distorted time, making hours feel longer and decisions feel urgent. It whispered that shortcuts were reasonable and risks acceptable. Caleb felt that pressure as a tightening in his chest, a restlessness that urged him to move faster and search harder. He countered it with routine. Each day began the same way, inventorying energy before spending it. Each decision passed through the same filter, cost versus return, now versus later. As days stacked together, he noticed changes that worried him more than weakness. Concentration slipped briefly, then returned. Small mistakes appeared in his thinking, not large enough to alarm, but enough to warn. He wrote mental notes, repeated rules aloud, and slowed further when impatience surfaced. Hunger was not loud yet, but it was persuasive, and persuasion was dangerous. By evening, he checked traps again, careful not to hope too much. Hope spent energy before reward arrived. Whether he found something or not, the walk back to camp felt longer than the walk out, a sign he did not ignore. He fed the fire, melted snow, and waited for warmth to settle before eating what little he had. Food at the end of the day worked harder than food at the beginning. As he lay down, stomach light but mind steady, Caleb understood the deeper threat. Cold could be planned for, and exposure could be managed. Hunger worked differently, reshaping decisions while pretending to be reasonable. It did not weaken the body first, it altered judgment, and judgment decided everything. In winter, shelter is not a place, it is a decision made correctly, or not at all. Tools can be lost, food can be delayed, but exposure collects its payment immediately. The land does not require mistakes to be dramatic, only consistent. Caleb Rourke knew that each night without proper shelter was a negotiation with shrinking leverage. Shelter began with logic, not construction. Caleb evaluated the landscape the same way he evaluated his own body, looking first for what would take heat away the fastest. Wind came before snow, and snow before ground. Wind stripped warmth invisibly, turning mild cold into something lethal within minutes. Snow pressed down and reflected cold upward. The ground drained heat steadily, a slow theft that never stopped. A good shelter addressed these threats in that order, because ignoring any one of them meant the others worked harder. He chose his site carefully, never where instinct first suggested. Valleys trapped cold air, and ridgelines invited wind. The best ground lay slightly elevated, near timber, but not beneath dead limbs that could fall under snow load. He tested the air with his face, turning until he found the direction that cut hardest. That was the wind he needed to block. Only after this decision did he touch a branch. The first step was a windbreak. Caleb leaned a framework of poles against a sturdy trunk, angling them low so the opening faced away from prevailing wind. Height mattered less than angle. A shelter too tall leaked heat upward. He chose his site carefully, never where instinct first suggested. Valleys trapped cold air, and ridgelines invited wind. The best ground lay slightly elevated, near timber, but not beneath dead limbs that could fall under snow load. He tested the air with his face, turning until he found the direction that cut hardest. That was the wind he needed to block. Only after this decision did he touch a branch. The first step was a windbreak. Caleb leaned a framework of poles against a sturdy trunk, angling them low so the opening faced away from prevailing wind. Height mattered less than angle. A shelter too tall leaked heat upward and invited drafts. He lashed joints tightly with cordage, conserving material but refusing shortcuts. A collapsed shelter at night cost more energy than it saved during the day. The second step was insulation. He layered spruce boughs thickly across the frame, overlapping them like shingles so snow slid rather than settled. Bark strips followed where he could find them, their rigidity creating air pockets that trapped warmth. Snow itself became part of the system, packed gently against the outer wall once the structure stood. Snow insulated when used deliberately, sealing gaps and slowing heat loss instead of smothering. The third step addressed the ground, the most overlooked danger. Caleb cut more boughs than he thought necessary and piled them deep beneath where he would lie. Earth pulled heat relentlessly, and thin bedding meant a long night of shivering. The boughs created space, lifting his body into warmer air and allowing moisture to settle below rather than soak clothing. He tested the bed by kneeling, feeling for cold seepage, and added more until the ground's presence faded. The final step was heat management. He positioned the fire just outside the shelter opening, close enough to warmth to reflect inward, far enough to prevent sparks from claiming dry needles. A low wall of snow and logs bounced heat back, doubling the fire's effect without doubling fuel consumption. He shaped the opening small, just wide enough to crawl through, because every inch left open was heat escaping. This was not comfort, it was control. A well-built shelter reduced caloric burn dramatically, often more than food could replace. Caleb understood why exposure killed faster than hunger. A hungry man with shelter could last weeks. An exposed man with food could last hours. The body spent energy first maintaining temperature, then movement, then thought. Once that order reversed, survival became luck. He monitored the shelter as the night progressed, adjusting as conditions changed. Snowfall thickened insulation, but also added weight. He brushed buildup gently, preventing collapse without stripping warmth. Wind shifted, probing new angles, and he responded by reinforcing weak spots before they failed. Shelter demanded attention, but that attention was cheaper than the cost of rebuilding at midnight with numb hands. Inside, the air grew warmer, not hot, just stable. Stability mattered. Sudden warmth encouraged sweat, and sweat invited cold. Caleb vented occasionally, letting fresh air circulate without opening the system entirely. Breath condensed on the shelter walls and froze, a reminder that moisture management did not stop once construction ended. As he lay still, listening to the muted sounds of the forest, Caleb thought about how often men misunderstood shelter. They treated it as a structure rather than a system, a thing built once instead of something managed constantly. He had seen crude cabins outperform clever designs simply because they blocked wind effectively. He had also seen elaborate shelters fail because they ignored the ground beneath them. The principles never changed, only the materials. Near midnight, the wind rose, testing the shelter's angles with more insistence. Snow hissed against the outer wall, and the trees creaked as if stretching. Caleb adjusted the fire, added fuel, and reinforced the windward side with more packed snow. The system held, but the pressure was increasing. He felt it in the way sound traveled, in the way cold pressed closer even without touching. He slept lightly, waking often, not from fear, but from responsibility. Each check confirmed the same truth. Preparation bought time, but time was never guaranteed. The storm was not here yet, but its approach was unmistakable. Beyond the shelter walls, the forest was changing its tone. Storm pressure was beginning to rise. The days began to blur, not because they were identical, but because they demanded the same discipline over and over again. Snow, trees, breath, and motion repeated until time lost its edges. In that repetition, silence grew heavy, pressing inward where conversation and reassurance once lived. This was the long march, where survival shifted from physical management to control of the mind. Caleb moved through the landscape as if through a loop, waking, breaking camp, walking, stopping, and building again. Each cycle carried the same sounds: boots compressing snow, fabric rasping with movement, the soft thud of breath against wool. Silence followed him closely, broken only by wind or the distant crack of ice adjusting to cold. There were no voices to answer his thoughts, no markers to prove progress beyond the ache in his legs and the slow wearing of daylight. Isolation did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated. At first, solitude sharpened focus, narrowing attention to immediate tasks, but as miles passed, it began to distort scale. Small decisions felt larger than they were. Minor discomforts demanded disproportionate attention. Caleb recognized the pattern from stories older men told of travelers who began arguing with themselves aloud, or worse, trusting the wrong thought simply because it was the only one present. He countered this by imposing structure where none existed. Each morning began with the same checks: hands, feet, weather, supplies. He spoke the steps quietly, not because he feared silence, but because sound anchored thought. Throughout the day, he counted paces in sets, resting briefly at fixed numbers rather than when fatigue insisted. This kept impatience from dictating stops and prevented exhaustion from hiding behind false urgency. Historically, men who traveled alone in winter developed these habits out of necessity. Trappers crossing empty country, messengers carrying news between distant posts, and hunters returning from failed seasons all learned the same lesson. The mind needed rails the way a trail needed markers. Without them, judgment wandered. Caleb remembered accounts of men who walked past shelter they had built themselves, unable to recognize it once fatigue and hunger altered perception. Solitude also tempted revision of plans. As the distance wore on, Caleb found himself renegotiating rules he had already proven sound. He questioned whether slower travel was still necessary, whether cutting across open ground might save time after all. These thoughts did not feel reckless, they felt reasonable, which made them dangerous. He answered them by returning to principle rather than circumstance. Conditions had not improved, his resources had not increased. Therefore, the plan stood. At midday, he recalculated distance again, a habit that grounded him in reality rather than imagination. He marked progress against known landmarks and estimated remaining miles with conservative math. 120 had become less, but not enough to celebrate. The number still outweighed comfort. Breaking it into days helped, but even days stretched long when measured step by step. He reminded himself that the land did not care how close he felt, only arrival counted. The silence pressed harder in open stretches. Crossing frozen flats where no trees interrupted wind or view, he felt exposed, not just physically, but mentally. There was nothing to distract the eye, nothing to interrupt thought. In these places, he focused deliberately on physical cues, the rhythm of breathing, the alignment of shoulders, the pressure of pack straps. Keeping the body organized kept the mind from drifting too far ahead, where fear and impatience waited. At night, alone beside his fire, memories surfaced uninvited. Faces from past winters, conversations half-remembered, choices that had led him here. He did not push them away, but he did not indulge them either. Dwelling on what could not be changed cost energy without return. Instead, he treated memory like weather, something to be noted and endured without engagement. Sleep came unevenly. Dreams were thin and restless, interrupted by cold checks and the need to tend fire. Still, He rose each morning with enough clarity to continue, which he counted as success. Many men failed not because their bodies gave out, but because their minds surrendered first, convincing them to stop trying before stopping was fatal. As the march continued, the weather began to shift in subtle ways. Wind patterns changed direction, carrying different smells. Clouds thickened, dulling light even at midday. Temperatures fluctuated, rising slightly before dropping harder at night. These signs did not promise disaster, but they signaled uncertainty. Caleb adjusted his pace again, preserving strength in case conditions worsened. On one long afternoon, he stopped and listened for a long time, sensing the land rather than reading it. The forest felt quieter than before, as if holding something back. He checked his gear, tightened straps, and moved on, knowing that awareness itself was a resource that could not be replaced once spent. As he walked into another gray evening, Caleb understood that the final outcome no longer rested solely on preparation or discipline. Those had carried him this far. Ahead, forces beyond control were gathering, indifferent to effort or intention. He built his shelter with care, fed his fire, and watched the sky darken. The weather would decide the final outcome.
Near failure does not announce itself with drama. It arrives as a narrowing. Options shrink, margins thin, and the body begins to speak in signals that cannot be ignored. In winter country, this is the moment when preparation is tested against reality. Caleb Rourke reached that edge not in panic, but in quiet deterioration. The first signs appeared in his hands. A faint tremor crept in when he stopped moving, not the sharp shake of cold alone, but a deeper vibration that lingered even near the fire. His fingers fumbled small tasks that once felt automatic. Knots took longer. Sparks missed tinder. These were not injuries, they were warnings. His legs followed soon after, heavy in a way that rest did not fully cure. When he stood, the world tilted for a moment before settling, and he waited until it did. Confusion arrived subtly. Thoughts repeated themselves without adding anything new. Decisions that once resolved quickly now demanded long consideration. He caught himself starting tasks without finishing them, setting down tools and forgetting where they lay. Each time he stopped, retraced his steps, and corrected the lapse. Ignoring these signs was how men walked past safety. Recognizing them was how they stayed alive. Caleb knew what this combination meant. Cold, hunger, and fatigue were converging, compressing the buffer he had built through discipline. He checked his systems methodically, the way he always had. Shelter remained sound. Fire could still be made. Water was available. Calories were the weak link and had been for days. The question was no longer how to travel efficiently, but whether travel itself was still the right answer. The final critical decision took shape as the land changed again. Ahead lay a stretch of exposed ground that would shorten the route significantly. Behind him, timber and shelter offered slower progress but protection. Pushing forward promised to reduce distance, but demanded energy he might not have. Stopping to build a more substantial shelter and wait could preserve strength, but waiting consumed time and food he did not possess in abundance. Neither option was safe. One was simply less final. He returned to the rules that had carried him this far. Slow was safer than fast. Systems over tools. Protect heat first, then water, then calories, then movement. These principles did not guarantee success, but they prevented catastrophic error. He chose to slow further, cutting the day short and reinforcing shelter beyond what seemed necessary. It felt like retreat, but it was alignment with reality rather than pride. As he worked, the margin between survival and death became uncomfortably thin. Every movement cost more than it returned. Each pause stretched longer. When he finished, he sat and waited for warmth to return, counting breaths until shaking eased. This was not rest, it was stabilization. He understood that another mistake, another mile pushed too hard, could tip the balance beyond recovery. Night fell heavy and early. The fire burned lower than usual, fed carefully to conserve fuel.
Caleb's thoughts wandered despite his efforts, drifting toward imagined outcomes that offered relief. He recognized the danger and anchored himself in task. Adjust bedding, check windbreak, melt snow. Motion, even minimal, kept the mind from slipping too far. Sometime after midnight, the wind shifted sharply, pressing cold against new angles of the shelter. He woke disoriented, unsure for a moment where he was or what time it was. That moment frightened him more than any storm. He corrected it by speaking aloud, naming place and plan until familiarity returned. This technique, taught by men who had nearly failed before him, restored order when memory faltered.
By morning, the tremor had lessened, but weakness remained. Caleb packed slowly, checking and rechecking, refusing to trust assumption. He faced the day with fewer reserves than before, and no illusion about the risk. He had reached the point where survival depended on outside change as much as internal discipline. Either the land would offer relief, or he would need help beyond his own making. He paused at the edge of his camp, looking both directions. The thought of rescue crossed his mind, not as hope, but as calculation. Trails might intersect, smoke might be seen, or he might have to extract himself inch by inch, accepting losses to preserve life. Either path carried cost, and he was running out of currency. Rescue or self-extraction would come at a price. Survival stories often end with relief, but the frontier never cared about endings. It cared about methods, habits, and the quiet decisions that accumulated long before anyone noticed the danger. When Caleb Rourke finally stepped out of the frozen country, what mattered was not that he lived, but how. The lesson was already written into every mile behind him.
The journey resolved without ceremony. There was no dramatic moment that separated danger from safety, only a gradual easing of pressure as signs of human presence returned. A faint trail packed by earlier travelers, cut stumps where timber had been taken, the smell of old smoke carried on wind that no longer felt empty. When he reached shelter that did not need to be built with numb hands, Caleb did not collapse. He sat, removed his pack, and let the stillness arrive. Survival, he understood, was not an explosion of feeling. It was the absence of immediate threat. Looking back, it would have been easy to credit luck. The weather could have turned harder. Traps could have failed entirely. One misstep might have soaked a boot or broken a binding. But luck did not explain the pattern of decisions that had carried him through. What saved him was not chance, but adherence to systems that worked regardless of conditions. He did not outrun winter. He outlasted it by refusing to violate its rules. The rifle, once thought essential, had not been the deciding factor. Its loss stripped away convenience and margin, but it also exposed what truly mattered. Fire, shelter, movement, and judgment remained available because they were skills, not objects. The rifle had supported those systems, but it had never replaced them. When it vanished beneath the ice, the illusion of dependence vanished with it. From that experience emerged principles older than Caleb and wider than his story. Doctrines learned and relearned by frontier travelers across generations. The first was simple. Heat comes before everything. A warm body can think, move, and adapt. A cold one cannot, no matter how strong or determined it is. Shelter and fire were not comforts, but priorities that shaped every other decision. The second principle followed closely. Slow preserves life. Speed tempted pride and promised relief, but it multiplied mistakes. Moving deliberately conserved energy, reduced sweat, and protected judgment. Distance covered at the wrong cost was not progress, it was debt. The third was that systems outperformed tools. A knife, cordage, and fire kit mattered only because they fit into a larger structure of use. No single item carried him through. The interaction between shelter, fuel, movement, and rest did. When one element weakened, the others had to compensate, or the whole system failed quietly. The fourth principle was caloric honesty. Hunger was not a feeling to be ignored or fought. It was information. It warned when plans needed adjustment and when ambition needed restraint. Ignoring hunger distorted judgment long before the body collapsed. Respecting it preserved clarity even when strength waned.
The fifth was that routine protected the mind. Isolation and repetition eroded confidence, but structure rebuilt it daily. Checklists, repeated actions, and spoken rules anchored thought when silence pressed hardest. Mental discipline proved as important as physical preparation. The sixth principle was humility before the land. The frontier did not reward bravery displayed for its own sake. It punished those who tried to impose will instead of adapting method. Caleb survived because he treated the environment as a constant, not an opponent to be defeated. The final principle was preparation without dependency. Tools were chosen not for their promise, but for their reliability within a system. When one failed, others could compensate. Redundancy lived in knowledge and habit, not in equipment lists alone. In this light, the rifle's loss was not tragedy, but instruction. It revealed which parts of survival were essential and which were supplemental. It forced a return to fundamentals that had sustained generations before modern convenience blurred their importance. The frontier had never promised fairness, but it offered clarity to those willing to read it. Caleb did not speak of the journey as an ordeal afterward. He described it as confirmation. Confirmation that strength without structure failed, that confidence without discipline faded, that survival belonged to those who prepared for loss as carefully as they prepared for success.
The frozen miles he crossed did not remember him, and the lake that claimed his rifle did not release it. But the doctrine he carried forward endured, passed quietly to others who listened. The frontier never rewarded strength, only preparation. This was never just a story about losing a rifle, it was about losing certainty. With every frozen mile, the frontier peeled away comfort, shortcuts, and illusion, leaving only discipline and decision. Survival came not from strength or luck, but from respecting the quiet rules of winter. And those rules, once learned, never let a man walk the land the same way again. Stories like this were meant to be passed hand to hand. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who understands why. And before you go, where are you watching from, and what would you have done differently out there?